Good morning to all. My name is Luis Solis. I'm the Interim Director of the Kimberly Green Latin American and Caribbean Center at Florida International University. And I thank you for participating in this conference that will put in front of us the major challenges the Caribbean region poses to the hemisphere and the many contributions it has made throughout the years to the international scene. We have an extraordinary number of panelists today, to whom I also thank for the willingness to participate in this academic exercise. I would like to tell you that this is the first of a series of 3 webinars that we will be holding in partnership with the Caribbean Policy Consortium. The Caribbean Policy Consortium and FIU have joined in this exercise, knowing that the Caribbean region is going to be, as it has been in the past, one of the most important and luminous areas of the Americas. And we would like to explore, with the help of our great presenters and researchers, a new perspective of Caribbean affairs with the people that are making policy, that have the experience and have been studying Caribbean affairs for a long, long time. This is why we have commissioned papers that are the basis for these webinars. They will be available to you once the final version is prepared with the final observations of our panelists, and also as part of a bigger understanding of our commitment, which has been ongoing for many years from FIU and from the Latin American and Caribbean Center at FIU about Caribbean affairs. So without any further ado, I would like to give the floor to our moderator and president of CPC, Dr. David Lewis, who will be guiding us through this webinar today. And once again, thank you so much for being part of this series of webinars that I'm certain will enrich our perspective of Caribbean affairs for the years to come. I thank you very much. David, you have the floor.
Thank you, President. Thank you, Luis. And our appreciation from CPC for this collaboration with FIU, which we've got it tied down for this year, and we're very optimistic as to the growth into the rest of this year. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. I will be the moderator today, this morning. I will first introduce the entire panel, give you short bios on them, and then we will go to the substance of the meeting. I will be advising each panelist when we need to cut short, and it's the next one. And then we will have periods of questions and answers, which you can place on the chat, and we will integrate them into the discussion. Our presenter today and main speaker is Dr. George Forial. He's a fellow with the Caribbean Policy Consortium and also a member of the think tank Haiti, a partnership of the Université Quisqueya in Haiti and the Inter-American Dialogue here in Washington. George is an adjunct faculty at the Georgetown University's Democracy and Governance program and also a senior associate with the Center for Strategic and International Studies here in Washington. He's widely published in the area of Caribbean and US policy issues in the region and also democratization dynamics, as he's the former vice president of the National Endowment for Democracy and former senior vice president of the National Endowment's International Republican Institute and director of the Americas program at CSIS. George will make his full presentation of the paper, which, as you heard from President Solis, will be posted on the FIU website, and then also you will receive those who are registered via email. Following George's presentation, we will have commentary in this order. First, Ambassador Richard Bernal. Richard, good morning. He is a fellow of the new Caribbean Policy Consortium, and up to 2020, he was the former pro-vice chancellor for global affairs at the University of the West Indies in Jamaica. Prior to that, from 2008 to 2016, he was Jamaica's member on the board of directors of the Inter-American Development Bank, and from 2001 to 2008 was the Director General of the Caribbean Regional Negotiating Machinery, leading the region's trade negotiations with the WTO, the Free Trade Area of the Americas, and the European Union. Prior to that, for a decade, from 1991 to 2001, he was Jamaica's ambassador to the United States and its permanent representative to the OAS. He has written extensively on international relations of the region, with recent books on China and the Caribbean, small states and international relations, and a pet peeve of many of ours, a new book just last year on the EU-US Caribbean banana dispute at the WTO during the 1990s. After Ambassador Bernal, we'll have Professor Jessica Byron. Good morning, Jessica. She is also a fellow of the Caribbean Policy Consortium and is professor and director of the University of the West Indies Institute of International Relations at the St. Augustine campus in Trinidad and Tobago. She has an extensive and distinguished career in regional and international academic circles covering international relations, security studies, Caribbean area studies, Caribbean Latin American regionalism, and small states societies in the global political economy, with extensive publications. She has also served extensively on regional and international policy advisory projects with the Caribbean Regional Negotiating Machinery, the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States, various UN agencies, and the ACP CARIFORUM group of states. Jessica will be followed by Daniel Erickson. Good morning, Dan. Dan is a senior fellow at the Penn Biden Center for Diplomacy and Global Engagement. Go Quakers. We've got two Quakers here on the panel today. From 2015 to 2017, he was the special advisor to Vice President Biden at the White House. And from 2010 to 2015, he was senior congressional advisor and senior policy advisor at the State Department, leading the Obama administration's efforts on the Northern Triangle of Central America, Colombia's peace process, and the reestablishment of US-Cuba diplomatic relations. He has been program director and senior associate at the Inter-American Dialogue, professorial lecturer at Johns Hopkins, Fulbright Fellow in Mexico, and research associate at the Harvard Business School, with many publications on inter-American relations. Closing the panel discussion will be Andrea Ewart, a fellow with the Caribbean Policy Consortium and principal of developed trade law in Washington, D.C., providing trade, customs, policy, and legal and business advisory services to clients. Her practice includes supporting Caribbean exporters in the US market and consulting for Caribbean governments on the WTO, the EU, and US trade relations, regional integration, trade negotiations, and gender and trade analysis in the Caribbean context. She is a former president of the Organization of Women in International Trade. And before I pass on to them, I just want to take my privilege as moderator, two personal anecdotes, which I think are very telling for this CPC collaboration with FIU LACC. Last year marked 40 years from when my father left the University of Puerto Rico for a year of teaching at FIU and working with Professors Anthony Mengo and Professor Mark Rosenberg, who is now the president of FIU, on that new university's Caribbean focus and its entry into area studies. This collaboration, which we launched today, for me is a sort of family reunion with Mark and Tony, who will join us in the second webinar we have in March, and now with Luis. And it's I want to give my personal and professional thanks due to both of them. The second one, which Luis would not mention, is that he himself is fulfilling a Caribbean family diaspora commitment, as his grandmother is from Limon on the Caribbean coast of Costa Rica and of Jamaican heritage herself. As a Caribbean diaspora person myself, I am pleased and proud that Luis has worked with us to advance this Caribbean renewal effort with FIU LACC. So, George, all yours now. Thank you all. We can start.
Thank you, David, for this generous introduction. Also want to take this opportunity also to thank Luis and his FIU colleagues for entertaining the idea of a seminar series on the Caribbean. So the paper that I drafted for this panel was envisioned as the basis for this discussion on Caribbean policy issues. Some of what I raise should be regarded as challenges. Others really suggest opportunities. Ultimately, I chose 6 themes. So by definition, this is not an exhaustive list. In fact, sort of a warning to our audience. For example, I will not say much about Cuba or even Haiti, although acknowledging that they are integral parts of any policy discussion on the Caribbean. I do take as a given what the title of this webinar seems to suggest, that is that the Caribbean is important. So the topic for discussion really relate to what policy issues underscore that importance. Trying to reimagine the region's policy framework probably begins by recognizing the degree to which the component parts of the region, of the Caribbean environment of politics and economics really operate at different speeds and with greatly varying capacities for action. And I think this reality underscores the need for pragmatic approaches and greater integration of Caribbean countries around common interests and related institutional arrangements. Let me hasten to say that this is not a new idea, but I think it needs new energy. So let me tackle this with sort of brief observations about the 6 themes that I identified. The first theme is one that clearly we wouldn't have thought about a year ago, and that's dealing with the global pandemic. The issue here is not just dealing with COVID-19, but generating the process, the responses that reverse the spread and also provides viable pathways out of the pandemic and make the region stronger. This encompasses a number of public health issues, notably in some ways, the next major hurdle, which will be access in sufficient quantities to new vaccines that are coming online, addressing the logistical implications of safeguarding their transport to the 4 corners of the region, and providing the requisite medical support infrastructure to ensure that populations receive vaccines safely and as rapidly as possible. There are related political and economic considerations which are severe for the region. In effect, what amounts to an implosion of the region's travel and hospitality sector. A baseline assumption regarding that sector in terms of sustainable economic recovery points to 2022, and that's in some ways a long ways off. Among the top 10 economies in the world most dependent on tourism, 8 of those are from the Caribbean. Synchronizing all of this with global actors to benefit individual Caribbean states is in some ways made to order for regional platforms such as Caricom, the Caribbean Community. The region can probably also envision capitalizing on some of its own technology infrastructure for COVID-19 related needs, including medical research, testing, production, perhaps even as generators of economic recovery and future development drivers. This sort of leads me to my second theme, which is not just economic recovery, but also highlights the notion of resiliency and innovation, a recovery that ensures that the Caribbean remains competitive globally. The renewal of the Caribbean Basin Trade Partnership Act, the CBTPA, by the United States Congress in the last quarter of 2020 provides a baseline platform for Caribbean-U.S. trade relations, but I think also should invite consideration to do more and probably requires a more robust engagement from Caribbean stakeholders as much as the United States. This will not be easy and requires coordination among key Caribbean governmental and regional institutions. This requires, among other things, a business-friendly environment, legal and administrative transparency, and engaged national political leadership throughout the Caribbean region. The incoming Biden administration, I think, may not view this as an immediate priority, but some elements, I think, of the United States Congress already appear interested in at least exploring what could be envisioned as a 21st century version of the Caribbean Basin Initiative, the CBI. This could capitalize on the unmet expectations of the legislation that was passed in late 2016, the U.S. Caribbean Strategic Engagement Act, whose implementation through Caribbean 2020 is, shall we say, incomplete. An overlapping opportunity for the region is the fact that the United States will host the 9th Summit of the Americas later this year, which brings together leaders of the entire hemisphere. And Caricom and the Caribbean community at large, including the private sector and civil society, have an opportunity to shape the summit agenda. That leads me to my third theme, which is really to be able to translate the incoming sort of Caribbean fossil fuel energy surpluses around particularly Guyanese production, to some degree also Suriname, renewal of exploration in Trinidad, into energy diversification and initiatives that really address the impact of climate change on the Caribbean. This engages also a turbulent mix of issues, including economic and political governance concerns in that region, and also commingles with the ongoing Guyana-Venezuela territorial dispute, as well as broader issues in terms of dealing with the volatile Maduro regime and related issues. A wider perspective raises an equally critical set of issues: the need for regional push for cooperation in renewable energy as the global energy system transitions away from nearly complete dependence on fossil fuels towards greater reliance on clean and renewable energy sources. As a backdrop to the regional conversation about energy change, energy diversification is probably a more sharper consensus in the region regarding climate change. It is viewed as a clear and imminent danger to the Caribbean. All of this points to a serious attention to issues related to the blue and green economies, opportunities for the sustainable use of ocean resources and management of coastlines while preserving the health of the Caribbean ecosystem. I should add that I think oil and gas industry will play a prominent role in the blue economy, as the industry itself needs to retool technologically. Absent US government policy interest in recent years on some of these issues, certainly American private know-how and investment nonetheless provides the basis for constructive engagement with the region. Fourth theme connects to the region's general adherence to democratic norms. These have been tested in the past year in the Dominican Republic and Guyana, but also it leads to the region's diverse and rich regional institutional environment, anchored primarily by Caricom and a whole universe of institutions and platforms. But this has not prevented the Caribbean from being perceived as a high-risk jurisdiction when it comes to money laundering and financial monitoring compliance. This has a practical impact on the Caribbean's ability and access to the financial global and trading system, notably relating to the withdrawal of corresponding banking relationships that in effect raise the cost of doing business in the Caribbean. It also paradoxically drives financial flows underground outside the banking and regulatory systems. There's a need really to do this in a better way, and for the Caribbean probably to convincingly address compliance obligations relating to money laundering, terrorism financing, tax evasion, and drug trafficking. That will not be easy. Brings me to the theme number 5, which is how the Caribbean deals with transnational non-state actors, including drug trafficking, organized crime, human trafficking, and related flows. On that note, a lot has already been said by many others over the years. Let's be clear. The global scope of these issues are beyond the individual and arguably even collective capabilities of Caribbean countries. While individually relatively small and insular, the region's governmental and cultural norms actually also invite openness and a sense of community that ironically has made the region probably even more vulnerable to these transnational organized crime and non-state threats. There's probably a threshold beyond which the cost and manpower needed to provide scale to these efforts becomes cost prohibitive, or at least is not sustainable. Even for the larger countries in the region, it is really worth questioning how far the international community is expecting them to budget limited resources to a mission whose scope of engagement to be effective involves the deployment of operational, let alone strategic resources that only the United States and a few other actors have in place. US policy might benefit from a significant reimagining of its approach to the Caribbean in this arena, which leads me to the 6th and final theme, really made up of 3 subparts to it. One is a brief comment on the US-China rivalry in the Caribbean, which has grown in recent years. Secondly, the makeup of US policy with the Caribbean. And then a third sort of quick note on what I would call potential policy breakdowns. Let me actually start with the latter. The immediate issue in terms of a timeline is probably a further policy breakdown in Haiti and Venezuela. The issue here is that in both cases, the Caribbean's capacity to shape developments in either country is limited. However, the repercussions from both of those countries are first felt in the region. Haiti's timetable is framed by the dispute over when President Moïse's mandate will end. Is it February the 7th, or is it a year from now? Even though Haiti is part of Caricom, the Moïse government has not welcomed offers of assistance in its current crisis, but Caricom's somewhat passive attitude so far on this issue will probably also have to change as the crisis worsens. Venezuela is a messier outlook, with the continuing outflow of people intermingled with the COVID-19 pandemic. There is really no unity of view in the region on relations with the Maduro regime. There's likewise a certain amount of discord among key actors in the region regarding an appropriate refugee asylum policy framework regarding the Venezuela crisis. This is really one clear area where urgent multilateral action is required, and perhaps even if it's somewhat unwelcome so early in the Biden administration, action is required by Washington, and Caricom should press this issue as well. The second part of this sixth theme is the China-US rivalry in the Caribbean. The main instrument of the Chinese arsenal in this area has been the appeal of the Belt and Road Initiative. The scope of the initiative underscores China's global and strategic ambition, and it has made inroads in the region, beginning with Trinidad and Tobago in 2018. Countries in the region are also accessing loans from the China Development Bank and the China Export-Import Bank. So there's an interaction that's ongoing and relatively diverse. A subplot to this US-China rivalry is China's efforts to stamp out some of Taiwan's residual diplomatic presence in the Caribbean region. Haiti, St. Kitts and Nevis, St. Lucia, St. Vincent, and the Grenadines still recognize Taipei as a legitimate government of China. However, beyond threats, the US policy response to China's expansive ambitions in the region point to what I would describe as an absence of economic statecraft. Belatedly, the new US International Development Finance Corporation is being deployed with an initial wave of efforts in the Caribbean. But really what's missing perhaps here more broadly is a more convincing demonstration from Washington of a willingness to really engage fully the Caribbean, which leads me to a concluding comment or speculation about the incoming administration defining an effective US Caribbean policy. The Caribbean is not likely to be a strategic arena inviting immediate action, but the issues that I've just described, I think certainly open up opportunities. A timely option that I mentioned a moment ago is really to update the original Caribbean Basin Initiative, the CBI, dating back to the 1980s. It has gone through several iterations since then, ultimately giving rise to the Caribbean Basin Trade Partnership Act, passed first in 2000 and renewed recently. It's a bit more complicated than that, in the sense that, for example, one major actor in the region, Dominican Republic, is not part of the CBI, even though it's the largest free economy in the region. It, in fact, is part of a separate agreement with Central America signed in 2005. Likewise, there are a number of sub-agreements to the CPTPA that have been negotiated with Haiti, particularly in the apparel textile sector. I say this because the impression that one is left with is a lack of a sharply defined strategic vision, and instead sort of a series of US initiatives across multiple sectors over time, in a mosaic of overlapping objectives, bureaucratic processes, competing constituency lobbying, uncertain budget support, and a somewhat confusing policy message to potential beneficiaries in the region. And I think an updated 21st century CBI could also provide an opportunity to merge some of this sort of encyclopedia of Caribbean-related US initiatives. There is some indication that the Caribbean and some of its subparts, including Haiti, are on the radar of members of the United States Congress, the US, the Senate, and the House, which starts perhaps with a focus on economic and trade policy issues. This also intersects with broader strategic policy interests regarding China, for example, and better policy tools to counter the Belt and Road Initiative in the Caribbean. Also, this could play into shifts in US trade flows from sourcing in China and other Asian markets to the Caribbean. Other assets that the Caribbean ultimately has on its side include the Caribbean's emergence as an oil and gas producer in a major way, in tandem with the willingness for joint action on climate change and renewable energy sources, let alone underscoring the overall democratic character of the region's governance norms. I think there's a lot to work on and to build a constructive Caribbean-U.S. dialogue. So let me end on this note. Thank you.
Thank you, George. As usual, very efficient on time, which is now going to help us. Don't even have to say you have 1 minute left. Just let me add before we start with our discussants, very interesting we'll see on Congress, because although we had a stalwart in Congressman Elliot Engel for many years, and that was very helpful, he's now left Congress, but the new chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee is Gregory Meeks from New York, who has a long tradition with the Caribbean and Latin America, and he's already stated that he wants to take a very strong role in terms of the new administration's work, particularly with countries like Venezuela and in the Caribbean. So that's going to be interesting. Very well, we're going to start our discussion session. Each commentator panelist has 7 minutes for responses, comments, questions, and so on. We'll start with you, Richard. Ambassador Bernal will focus on the economic, diplomacy, policy perspectives, regional economy, trade, and hemispheric linkages, and of course, especially the diplomatic experience perspective of the region vis-a-vis the US government, the OAS, and governmental policy mobilization here in the US. Thank you, Richard.
Good morning, all. I want to acknowledge President Solis, moderator David Lewis, and thank George Foriol for his very good paper, which sets the stage for the discussion. I have an impossible task, so I've had to be selective in what I can get in the 7 minutes. I want to divide my comments into 3 areas: the internal aspects, the external aspect, and then looking at resilience with particular attention to the economic implications of that. First of all, the region was in a long-term structural economic crisis since 2008. And that has been aggravated by the global pandemic and its impact on the central sector in most of the Caribbean, which is tourism. So it has compounded the crisis. The state of the region is one in which the regional apparatus has held up well, but there has to be a rethink of the region. There is considerable disunity, which has prevented the region from acting as effectively as possible as a bloc, and it needs to be rebuilt. There is a shifting center of the economic gravity of the region, both to the north and to the south. To the south, Ghana, Suriname, and Trinidad, whose energy resources are not yet exhausted. And to the north, around the rapidly growing Dominican Republic. And I think that this is going to cause a split within the region as the center of gravity of the economy moves around. Turning quickly to external relations, the Biden administration will usher into US policy a different approach to the Caribbean. The Caribbean should not expect to be a priority at this time. It doesn't have great strategic value, and there are so many other things which urgently require addressing in a reoriented foreign policy approach. Secondly, China. The region continues to have a major infrastructure deficit, and the financing for that, both private and development aid, is less and less. China still has funds available, and this will be attractive to the Caribbean. Of course, the Caribbean will have to take note of the US-China rivalry. I think that will be less intrusive because I expect the Biden administration to have a less combative approach to China. Post-Brexit EU, region will have to develop much better diplomatic relations with a wider range of countries as its primary ally, the UK, exits the EU. The trade relations are minimal, but they shouldn't be disrupted because Britain has already signed an agreement with the Caribbean, which parallels the Economic Partnership Agreement. The fourth aspect of international relations, which is a priority, is the Caribbean making use of and helping to rebuild multilateralism from the World Health Organization, the WTO, the United Nations, the OAS, etc. Turning now to resilience. First of all, there is the question of environmental resilience. There is the long-term factor of climate change and its impact and how to finance resilience to that. But that is also compounded by the regularity of natural disasters, which have such a catastrophic effect on the Caribbean's viability. Secondly, economic resilience. The pandemic has shown up how undiversified the economy is and how dependent it is on external factors such as the tourism. This needs to be examined. This is not a new issue, but the Caribbean has to redouble its efforts in this respect. Third point is there's a coming third or fourth wave debt crisis in the Caribbean. As the Caribbean struggles to compensate in its economy by government spending to alleviate poverty, to address public sector, public health issues, it's going to aggravate that crisis. There's need for a multilateral initiative to try to alleviate the debt crisis in the Caribbean. There will be a lot less aid, and the Caribbean will just have to find a way to get on with less aid, especially from traditional sources like the US and the UK. The delisting and the loss of correspondent banking relations seriously affects the Caribbean. They have to do something about that. That's both in terms of engaging countries in the EU and the US, but also improving their regulatory regimes in the financial sector. Transnational crime, ongoing issue.
1 minute, Richard.
Yes, I'm on my second to last point, sir. Ongoing issue which needs attention. And finally, corporate integration. The Caribbean firms need to go global. They remain small. They need to integrate and bulk up first on a regional level, and then that's a platform to go globally. What is happening now is many corporate headquarters are being relocated to Miami, Mexico, and the Dominican Republic. If they are to be retained in the region, there has to be a corporate reorganization. Thank you, moderator. Thank you, panelists, and thank you and good morning to the audience.
Thank you, Richard. Excellent as usual. We'll now go on to Jessica Byron, who will address the regional international policy perspectives and the Caricom regional governance institutionalities and the external linkages. Jessica?
Now I'm not muted. Happy New Year, everybody, in this challenging year. Let's hope it brings some good. I endorse everything that Richard Bernal has just said. Now, we have a region full of small territories, a long list of vulnerabilities that you're all well aware of, and including, in addition to the other aspects of the additional stress brought by COVID-19, I wanted to just mention the vulnerability, the increased vulnerability of large numbers of marginalized people in our societies who are trapped in the informal economy with very limited access to social protection and safety nets. And their situation has been exacerbated greatly during COVID-19 because of the lockdowns, etc. Now, against this backdrop of challenging material conditions, what are Caribbean international interests in a rapidly evolving international order? Caribbean territories still have strong attachments to traditional partners like the United States and Canada and Europe, and those will continue. But the Caribbean is equally sensitive to the major contemporary global and regional changes, the growing weight and dynamism of the Asia-Pacific region and its possibilities, the significance of our Southern and Central American neighbors, and the growing importance for us of South-South cooperation in general. So these are the premises and the vantage points that small Caribbean states and societies start from when trying to elaborate balanced regional and international policy positions. And so it works for small players to exercise multifaceted diplomacy with great agility, to make use of all the multilateral forums and alliances available to them, while also developing and maintaining bilateral relationships and exploring both public and private sources of financial capital and development resources. And in this context, regionalism and regional coordination networks are of particular strategic value for small states located in complex geopolitical areas. Outside of the Caribbean, we can cite similar examples in the European Union, in the Nordic area, in ASEAN, and Oceania. So although we tend to take our Caricom and OECS structures for granted, and we are often very critical of them, they have provided invaluable support and stability for our small Caribbean states and territories. And it must be remembered that our regional machinery has been among the most stable and durable of regional arrangements in this hemisphere. The ACS and to a lesser extent CELAC are complementary organizations that are also valuable conduits to closer cooperation with the Greater Caribbean and the rest of Latin America. Caricom is significant because it coordinates regional policy formulation and its implementation at both regional and national levels. And it encompasses, you know, it's a full service organization in many ways. Now, all its functions, economic integration, foreign and community policy, legal cooperation, support for democracy, multidimensional security policies, and human and social development, and environmental policies are all carried out by a network of associated regional agencies and institutions. The OECS demonstrates the deepest level of institutional integration in the Caribbean, as it encourages a union, a common legal system, and the full implementation of the freedom of OECS citizens to live and work across their sub-region, something that Caricom has not fully carried out yet. And I think a deeper level of integration amongst the OECS has been facilitated by their micro size and their limited resources. So Caricom, the OECS, and the ACS are also strategically important because they have facilitated the integration of the wider Caribbean, particularly through the institutional arrangements for the associate membership of non-independent territories in the Caribbean. And this has enhanced the scope of cooperation activities and strengthened links with the Caribbean territories of European countries in particular. Now, Caricom has many strengths and also weaknesses, and it has had both successes and shortcomings in its foreign policy coordination. But its strongest area of foreign policy coordination has been in influencing global multilateral development agendas and providing a common platform and greater visibility for small Caribbean actors to engage with these global arenas and to exercise greater leverage on policy areas that are important to our interests. Now,
1 minute, Jessica.
Yeah. Okay, so I won't have much more time to go into that, but I just wanted to mention that While Caricom has shown great success in regional policy coordination during COVID-19, historically, it has had far less success in coordinating its bilateral relations with the United States and with China, with major global players, and similarly in recent times with Venezuela. Another strength of our regionalism has been the support for democratic governance, and most recent success was in facilitating a peaceful outcome to the Guyanese election process, and various areas of human development. Now, weaknesses, I wanted to say something about that. Shortfalls. CARICOM and the OECS remain tremendously under-resourced, especially at present with the catastrophic economic impact of COVID-19. There are major capacity constraints in foreign policy coordination. It's probably better supported in economic diplomacy than others. And while recognizing the growing significance of the diaspora as a resource for Caribbean countries, not much is done to promote or operationalize the concept of a regional diaspora or to have its importance reflected in the CARICOM machinery. And another area of shortfall in CARICOM has been consistent regional policy development on opportunities for youth, very important area. And now I finally wanted to say that a major area of convergence with the United States, well, first of all, with regard to US-Caribbean relations in the new administration, it would be desirable to return to structured policy dialogue processes that show due regard for Caribbean institutions and procedures, and that do not seek to undermine regional unity by operating divide and rule tactics. A major area of convergence is likely to be climate change, adaptation, and mitigation. In my view, some states would hope to have the US as an important potential source of support in our approaches to multilateral financial institutions for funding at concessionary rates and for relaxing the rules on financing for middle and upper income, but extremely vulnerable developing countries. The Caribbean might welcome the return of initiatives such as the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative, which had an important dimension of funding projects for vulnerable youth susceptible to gang recruitment. The Caribbean would hope to see a rethink of US approaches towards both Cuba and Venezuela, as the present approaches are quite unproductive. And as in the Caribbean context, Cuba has been an important human development partner. Finally, I believe the Caribbean region will continue to view China and other Asian countries as significant global players and will hope to continue development partnerships with China while also trying to avoid tensions with the United States as a result. Sorry, David.
That's okay. Thank you very much. Very well.
Okay.
Thank you, Jessica. Now, Dan, who we're targeting to focus on the US policy perspectives with the region, and particularly the expertise from the Obama administration and linkages in terms of looking forward with the Biden-Harris administration, and also congressional relations as a separate aspect. Thank you, Dan.
Great, thank you so much, David. It's great to be here with you today. I would also like to thank President Solis and the partners at Florida International University. It's always great to be with you virtually, even if we're not actually together yet, although hopefully regular conferences will resume at some point later this year. And also, I was really pleased with the title of the panel, The Importance of the Caribbean, no question mark attached. I do think that this is a vital region for the United States for strategic reasons, cultural reasons, trade reasons. And although often it doesn't get as much priority as it should, I do think that there's a lot of opportunities ahead, and it's important to be looking at them as occurs in the paper that George Forial prepared. I think it's clear to everyone that one of the major tasks that will be confronting the next administration is rebuilding ties both globally and regionally with a range of different partners. And I think the Caribbean fits very much into this. As has been stated by some of the previous panelists, the Caribbean, in some ways, can be a challenging region to engage, in part due to the diversity that exists throughout the region in terms of size, language, capacity, different national interests, different forms of sovereignty as well. But I do think that as a collective, the Caribbean remains a very important region to engage in, and among a number of the different dimensions that were already mentioned, whether that's through maritime security, the importance of democracy and democracy promotion in the region, the press for greater transparency and the fight against corruption, the management of foreign powers in the region and how that should be dealt with, and of course, strengthening multilateral institutions, particularly with respect to the Organization of American States. The Caribbean has quite a large say at the Permanent Council of that institution due to the number of countries represented. And so that, I think, is an important venue. And then, as what Jessica alluded to in her presentation, climate and climate policy and energy. And we've all seen already the degree to which the incoming Biden administration has really prioritized the climate and the fight against climate change as a major priority that's going to be important. You know, there's kind of two ways, I think, to frame this issue of U.S.-Caribbean relations. The more traditional way, in some senses, is, you know, what should U.S. policy towards the Caribbean be, and what is the United States trying to offer the Caribbean? And then the converse way is, how should the Caribbean seek to integrate with and provide value to U.S. policy priorities? And I definitely encourage, and I've had a lot of discussions, obviously being based in Washington, on the first, but I really do encourage the region to look at the second. President-elect Biden has laid out quite comprehensively a set of broad foreign policy plans. He wrote an article in January a year ago in Foreign Affairs called "Why America Must Lead Again," which he really frames this notion of the U.S. developing a foreign policy for the middle class. And I think it's an interesting question for the Caribbean to look at. What does a foreign policy for the middle class of the United States mean for the Caribbean? Are there ways that the Caribbean can actually contribute to that objective that's good both for the countries of the region and good for the United States? And I think that really, rather, you know, we're talking a lot of very kind of specific niche issues, but, you know, I would also encourage a 30,000-foot view of U.S. foreign policy and seeing where the Caribbean matches up with some of these global priorities. Climate is clearly one of them. Energy as well, and clean energy is also clearly one of them. And then, of course, you've got the security components as well. Going back to lessons from the Obama administration, in some ways, the early part of the Obama administration was very fortuitous, because due to really nothing more than the coincidence of the international calendar at the time, one of President Obama's first foreign visits was to the Caribbean, to Trinidad and Tobago in the spring of 2009 for the Summer of the Americas. In fact, I was in Trinidad and Tobago for that summit, engaged in an academic conference hosted by the University of West Indies, discussing some of the same issues that we're covering here today. And so I think that there was an early focus for the Obama administration in the Caribbean. And then moving forward in the latter part of the administration, Vice President Biden took on quite a large role in hemispheric affairs and really helped to drive many of the agenda issues forward in terms of both developing political partnerships, economic partnerships, and really looking at these issues of sustainable economic growth and energy security. And I think that, you know, there's a clear recognition that the national security of the United States is linked to the prosperity and the security of the Caribbean region. And I think that another issue that'll be very much at the forefront for everyone is the coronavirus response and the need to come up with public health policies to address this pandemic, as well as to lead it towards an economic recovery. As we all know, the Latin America, George says in his paper, the Caribbean region perhaps has not been hit quite as hard by the coronavirus pandemic, but certainly the Latin America region has. both in terms of number of cases as well as the overall economic impact. We all know this has been devastating for the tourism industry, which is particularly important for the Caribbean. And so I think trying to work on both the public health dimensions and the economic dimensions moving forward will be particularly important. And on the climate—
1 minute, Dan.
Okay, on the climate piece, there is also some muscle memory from the Obama administration around energy security. Vice President Biden hosted actually 2 summits on this issue, starting with the Caribbean Energy Security Summit in 2015, followed on by an additional summit in 2016 that focused on both the Caribbean and Central America. And so I think that is an area that's really ripe for exploration. And then, David, if I could just conclude by building on some of the comments that you made in terms of the US Congress, I do think that within Congress, the fact that Chairman Meeks will be taking over the House Foreign Affairs Committee is going to be a significant development. It means that there still will be a friend of the Caribbean in charge of one of those powerful committees in the House. And I think that that is something that we can also build on. Although, of course, Eliot Engel, as we all know, was also a champion of the Caribbean and played an important role there. So I definitely see this as an area that, despite all of the challenges that we're discussing today, where there is quite substantial opportunity, but I think it's going to take both sides of the equation, both the Caribbean region itself, as well as the United States, to come up with a path forward that's to the benefit of all the parties. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Dan. Our final speaker, Andrea Ewart, is going to focus on some of the regional US cross-sectional perspectives from Caricom, but also the perspective from the US side in terms of non-government mobilization in the US, diaspora, civil society, and the private sector. Andrea, on to you.
Thank you, David. I'm going to try to do some of those things at the very least. And thank you to FIU LACC for the opportunity to be here. I also want to thank George for beginning his paper with a reminder of the things about the region that we are actually able to celebrate. We've so very often focused on the problems and challenges, and of course I'm going to talk about some of those, but I also want to highlight where some concrete action can be taken by governments, regional entities, and actors such as the private sector and the diaspora. I'm not an energy expert, but this is something I feel so passionate about. It's the caution from among this list of positives through the emergence of our new oil and gas producers in the midst of a situation where other countries continue to rely on importing these very expensive non-renewable resources. And I think it is so important that Guyana and Suriname not be visited by the oil curse. And so I think part of the way to do that is to move forward in a regional context, to look at a plan to capitalize on the expected revenues that will serve not just the interests of the two countries, but also help to build the regions, to meet the region's sustainable development goals, including supporting the transition to renewables. There is a good, healthy balance that can be struck here, but it will require careful and strategic thought and planning at the national and at the regional levels. At a more granular level, there are also investment opportunities for the private sector. And I think there is a role here for things like our chambers of commerce and other private sector business support organizations to collect, to find this information and disseminate it to, so that the local companies as well as companies in the diaspora can learn about these opportunities and figure out where and how they can begin to capitalize on them. I also wholeheartedly agree with George about another area of opportunity for countries to capitalize on the existing manufacturing, assembly, and technological infrastructure, and to expand that into areas like the medical research, testing, and production that's going to be needed to help get the world, not just the region, out of this pandemic. At the same time, I want to highlight one of Ambassador Bernal's point about the need for corporate growth, corporate convergence. We need to think outside of the Anglo-Caribbean and embrace one of the realities that George also points out, which is that the region's three largest economies, Cuba, Dominican Republic, and Haiti, have populations and a geographic size that dwarf the rest of the Caribbean. George's words, not mine. The DR has the strongest economy in the Caribbean. And in 2020, I saw a post recently, it attracted the lion's share, I think it was somewhere around 50% or something like that, of foreign direct investment into the region. There's a reason for that. We can go into that more into the Q&A, but the point is to point out, one of those is that the DR has actually moved aggressively to take advantage of the EPA. Cuba, we know, is advanced in the area of medical R&D, and Haiti has a huge market and also a strong assembly sector. So can private sector actors be encouraged and supported in exploring these opportunities in a regional and then in a global context? And at the same time, what's needed with respect to governments is for them to really get out of the way of those companies that are ready to innovate and focus on another area that George and other speakers have highlighted, which is the need to improve the business operating environment. And indeed, those types of reforms are going to be key, irrespective of what area of growth we're talking about to further economic resiliency. If it's the blue economy, the digital economy, concerted action to address these challenges in the area that impede the region's growth are so important. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the CBI and to highlight to clarify really that the Caribbean Basin Initiative has emerged in this hodgepodge way because it is a US-driven initiative pieced together by legislation. It has not been negotiated. Of course, I'm sure that there are regional actors as well as members in the diaspora that have played a role, but at its core, it is a US-driven unilateral preferential program created by legislation. And that is in a lot of ways what explains the sort of hodgepodge and the piece that, nature that George highlighted. At the same time, it is actually the most generous preferential program that the United States has with any other region of the world. And so I am not sure that there is a lot of room really to expand to build on its current focus, which is on trade in goods. We know that there have been attempts to shift to find out how can we expand preferences into services. I'm sure David remembers the SOCA campaign. I love that name, but not a lot of traction in a lot of area. And so room to grow. And so I wonder whether it's not time for the US, for the region, to be willing to explore a trade in services agreement with the United States. Services are, is our area of growth. CBI does not cover services at all. It is a trade in goods mechanism. There is a huge amount of goodwill towards the Caribbean in the US government, as evidenced by the fact that we were able to get CBTP renewed in an election year. And the region needs to engage with the US around this issue beyond talking about extending preferences. No one, as I said, has figured out how to do this in the area of services trade.
1 minute.
Thank you. We have signed a reciprocal agreement with the European Union that includes services, so that undermines the sort of this thing, oh, well, we continue to need a unilateral approach in this area. So it is important and time to explore a deal with the United States. And I want to highlight the need to use the Trade and Investment Council, these biannual meetings that were set up under the TIFA, more effectively. I think before every TIC meeting, there needs to be, Caribbean town hall meetings, going around with the private sector, with civil society, collecting ideas and thoughts and energy so that the Caribbean governments and participants in these TIC meetings go with an agenda that reflects the issues and the challenges and the opportunities that we need to explore in strengthening US-Caribbean relationship. And one last point, 30 seconds, on the Caribbean diaspora. I think the approach from the governments towards the diaspora is bring in investments, bring more money. And I think there is less evidence of or recognition of the role that the diaspora can play and should be playing in helping to cement US-Caribbean relations. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Andrea, and for remembering those of us who are diaspora. Well, thank you very much, all of you. We're exactly on 11:01, so we have 29 minutes before our hard close at 11:30. Those were some excellent comments, issues. Let me just couple of points, and then I'll run by some of the questions that have been posted, and we'll run by a second round of 3 minutes for each of you. Good point on the Dominican Republic investment, Andrea. Actually, people don't realize it, though. 65% of the Dominican economy today is in services. So even a manufacturing center like that has focused a lot on services. And you're right on target on the need to focus the region on services and the use of the TIC. And the best example of that, since 2008, Uruguay signed a TIC and a TIFA with the United States. And I tease my friends at USTR that Uruguay has managed to have all the benefits of a free trade agreement with the United States through that TIC, with none of the legal baggage or responsibilities of an FTA. And today, Uruguay, a small economy, 4 million people, is the South American hub for international technology and digital services with all the major global companies there. So it's something that can be done, and they have managed that TIC mechanism very well. Let me run through a few of the questions that have been posted from the audience. You can take notes, and then we'll run through each of you 3 minutes in the same order, and you can pick and choose from them accordingly. If I see that something has been missed, I will raise it again. It's been mentioned on the issue of debt relief and multilateral support with the pandemic recovery, and there's a question regarding the prospects of waiver on restrictions for high-income, middle-high-income CARICOM countries for IFI support, debt relief, and so on, which I know is something that has been worked on. Any comments on that? We've discussed the post-pandemic recovery, but specifically, if anybody can draw attention to the travel, tourism, hospitality, and entertainment sector, which is where the region has been hit, although not so much on the health side. With regards to more questions with regards to congressional engagement, so any comments on that are welcome. And then with regards to some other issues, on the UK CARICOM agreement, which is based on Cotonou, is there any space for revisions, updating on that? Question with regards to trade and diplomatic relations for the Caribbean with Africa, as well as some issues with regards to crime and security, public health, education, and poverty alleviation, which I know both Andrea and Jessica had mentioned. We also have a question with regards to relations and agreements with states and non-state actors outside the region. An example of California's tourism agreements with Mexico and Israel, and how something like that could be advanced. And also with regards back to the question of engaging the Biden administration, non-traditional sort of proactive approaches on bringing issues to the forefront and not waiting for the administration to take the lead on those issues. We have some questions regarding China, which have been addressed, multilateralism, which you can post on again, and again, with regards to trade and investment with the US, but also post-COVID and trade policy, specifically with the United States. Let me close that there. George, you will have a few extra minutes in case there are issues you want to bring in from your presentation, and then we'll continue the same order. Richard, Jessica, Dan, and then Andrea. Thank you.
Thank you, David, and thank you for the rest of the panelists, the rich comments, and now additional thoughts from our audience. Let me just maybe emphasize one point which cuts across several of the comments we already have heard, which is the degree to which one underestimates the role of the Caribbean diaspora in the policymaking context. You're right, the comment about the fact that the diaspora is mostly thought about in terms of remittances or potential even skills transfers or some other sort of direct channel, but is really overlooked, or maybe put it differently, not developed and capitalized in a way that only can help shape Caribbean interests when talking about US policy developments. And I think that has been sort of done in some ways through sort of a selective self-selection process. Certain communities in the United States are more engaged than others. Certain diaspora are more institutionalized than others. Again, to pick on the Dominican Republic has a very sophisticated, long-standing engagement of its diaspora, the United States and North America generally. It has a number of cultural, political, and other related interests that only puts a lot of energy and dynamism in the relationship between the United States and the Dominican Republic. The Caribbean is in some ways more compartmentalized. Even its sort of Anglo-Caribbean component is itself sort of a series of subsets. I think this is an arena that can really be developed in a very fruitful way. And in any discussion about whether it's in the context of future trade or service agreements, or in a context of any kinds of initiative where the Caribbean is actually trying to generate a new series of engagement with the United States, I think a significant partner in that discussion needs to be the Caribbean diaspora. And this is not something which will happen on its own. It will require some engagement, some significant engagement from the Caribbean itself. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Richard? Richard, you're muted.
Sorry, in the 3 minutes I have, I linked two issues, the issue of graduation and the issue of debt relief. From the perspective of the multilateral development finance institutions and the developed countries, the Caribbean is relatively well off compared to most developing countries, and therefore I don't see an easing of the rules relating to graduation, which relate to per capita income, which is relatively high in the Caribbean. However, debt relief and debt crises are not related to income level. Many countries, including some developed countries with much higher income levels, have had debt crises. So this is the time to make a démarche for a special debt relief package for middle-income, small middle-income developing countries. And it will be done on the basis that the debt crisis is not from fiscal mismanagement, but from crises related to disasters and the pandemic, and that it's not tied to income level. And finally, it's a relatively small amount of money that will be required to provide debt relief to the small Caribbean countries, which are and have been among the most highly indebted in the entire world.
Thank you, Richard. Jessica? You're muted. Hello? Oh, there you go.
Yeah, sorry about that. I've used up most of my time. No, I wanted to, in terms of the resuscitation of the tourism and entertainment sectors, I wanted to draw attention not only to the fact that it's going to depend really on the recovery process in our tourism markets abroad, but the severe challenges of transport within the Caribbean now. One of the knock-on effects of COVID-19 lockdowns has been that movement within the Caribbean, between Caribbean countries, has all but completely disappeared. It is more difficult at the moment to get from one Caribbean country to another than it is to get from the United States into the Caribbean. And I think that is going to take a while to regenerate, and it's going to require some private investment and a very hard look at what is required both in air transport and sea transport within this region. So I wanted to mention that. And I also think when I think of recent years, a lot of the investment and a lot of the cooperation in renewable energy has in fact come from actors in Europe, for example. The role of Iceland in collaborating with Dominica in the geothermal energy generation, and France. And for instance, at UWI St. Augustine, there's a very good postgraduate program in renewable energy in the Faculty of Engineering. It has been supported primarily by Germany. So, you know, there hasn't been for some years significant US engagement in these areas, and it would be welcome to see a return of interest in that. Also in our forays into really developing a sustainable and a productive blue economy.
Very good,
So
thank you.
I'll stop there.
Dan, and just Dan, we've had about 4 new questions being very specific on proactive steps for engagement with the Biden administration. I'd be tongue-in-cheek, but I suspect people want President-elect Biden's WhatsApp number, which they assume you have. But if you can draw some attention to that aspect of questioning.
Okay, thank you. I mean, you know, I'll just make a couple brief points. You know, one of them actually reflecting on my time in government. One thing I learned is, you know, never bring a problem to someone unless you're also bringing the solution. And so I think that for the Caribbean to advance, it needs to be coming to the table with its own solutions in hand. And that's going to be a very important dimension of any relationship. The other piece I wanted to mention just briefly on Congress, and I know that we all know this, but it's just worth kind of restating. In the Senate, after the election in Georgia, the split is 50-50, which means that the Vice President Harris will be the tiebreaker. That's what makes it a Senate majority. In the House, right now, we have 222 Democrats, 211 Republicans, and 2 vacancies, which means just a difference of 5 or 6 votes represents the majority. What does that mean? That means that policy, even though the Democrats control both houses of Congress, it means the policies that are most likely to advance will have bipartisan support. What does that mean for the Caribbean? That means that the Caribbean, and for the purpose of this conversation, I'm really talking about the Caricom Caribbean, I think perhaps has an advantage in that it can perhaps move things. And as Andrea referenced the passage of the Trade Act, you know, in late 2020, I think that where there are areas, you know, that are relatively less controversial, where there is bipartisan support, you're more likely to get traction. And so that has to be an important element to this. And then just going back to the issue of how to get the tourism industry to recover, I think that, you know, there's really going to have to be close collaboration around the public health dimension of this in order for that to advance. It's been very clear that the incoming Biden administration is very focused on the science, public health, and that's going to be a main driver of a lot of the policies. And so I think the Caribbean needs to be very much in step with that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Andrea, you're muted. There you go.
Yes, thank you, David. So much, so little time. One of the questions talked about the importance, talked about South-South trade, very complex, and some of the transportation issues that Jessica mentioned, of course, are crucial in this, but that is definitely a path forward for the Caribbean. Dan talked about the importance of needing to come with solutions even as the problems are presented. And this is where I think things like, again, actively learning how to really engage with the US. I think the diaspora plays a very important role in this, because a number of us have developed these skill sets, whether for our jobs or for other positions, roles that we play. And so engaging with the diaspora, things like using, as I said, the TIC process are very, very important for helping to turn engagements with the United States into productive discussions that can produce real results. I also want to underscore the role of the Dominican Republic Free Trade Agreement with the US as part of the CAFTA as an important catalyst for the DR's growth, for its engagement with the United States. And finally, how do we translate discussions like these? We have discussions, we have policy papers. How do we find ways and platforms to translate these into policy and concrete action? I think that is a task that I would really love for us to focus on in 2021. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Let me pick up on that, because that's exactly what the Caribbean Policy Consortium was started for, to see how we can translate into action. And this launch is actually going to help a lot in terms of some specific actions here in the US and in the region. And that's why the collaboration is not US to the Caribbean, but it's US and Caribbean engagement. Let me add a couple of things there. We've got about 12 minutes left. Dan is right on target. Engaging with the US, not just policymakers, but the business community, civil society. The key challenge is not just bringing problems to the table, but options of solutions, or at least how the problems can be minimized. I learned early in my work in government in the 80s, precisely with the Caribbean Basin Initiative, come to Washington saying, how can we help you handle this problem? And if you have some ideas on how you can help the US on something that isn't working, that is also always something very positive. The diaspora role, I think, is critical. And I think we'd be remiss if we didn't mention that during those 4 months last summer in the Guyana election crisis, the Guyanese American diaspora from New York to Florida, across to Texas, which is now the #2 state in the union with Guyanese American population, obviously because of energy, played a critical role in terms of engagement with Congress, with the administration, and with the OAS. We have a couple of more points just to add, and then I think we can go back to each one of you quickly. 1 minute if you want to, if not. One question regarding our focus on economic growth initiatives and the challenges in terms of inequality with economic growth, not the same thing, and the growing inequality in the region, particularly linked to the youth, crime, security issues, unemployment. And then a very interesting issue with regards to the fact that the region has a productivity deficit. And how can that be overcome now using digitalization as a sort of equalizer? I'm reminded, of course, of the great American economic guru, Alan Greenspan, who always said, I'm not worried about debt. I'm not worried about the interest rate. Why? Because the US is the most productive economy in the world, and that's what takes us out of any problem. So question on productivity. And another one with regards to using energy in the Southern Caribbean Basin, the Guyana, Suriname, Trinidad Basin, as an engagement angle with the US and the OAS and other organizations. So I'll just start in the same order. You can comment if you will, and if not, you can pass. George?
Thank you, David. Let me maybe just pick up a little bit on that last thought involving sort of the productivity deficit. I think actually the Caribbean has perhaps sort of an unused talent pool, which needs to be both interconnected within the region, but also in some ways employed by the region to address global issues. There are modernizing economic aspects, particularly in Barbados, Jamaica, Trinidad, among others, that are well positioned in this regard. 5G communication technology is sort of spreading into the region. I think particularly what I'm thinking about is sort of the underutilized. It's a region-wide issue. Underutilized computer experts, app developers, sort of budding IT entrepreneurs, and startups that actually can capitalize on this environment also where artificial intelligence is going to be an important player in the future of economic development, and how the Caribbean positions itself in this arena is critical. Again, as I mentioned earlier, I think this requires a business-friendly environment and sort of administrative machinery that can respond quickly to these kinds of developments. Thank you.
Thank you. Richard?
Thank you, moderator. The issue of getting on the US policy agenda is dependent on proposals which also bring benefits to the United States of America. This is particularly important in getting attention in Congress. Vitally important to engage by not coming with problems, but with solutions which are of interest to the US. There are several areas where there are mutual interests. One of them is in climate change, and we have to make sure the proposals which the region is making to the administration and Congress focus in that way. I would add to that the Caribbean needs to, although it has wonderful diplomatic representation, there's always need for specialized technical advice from people who know Washington well. And I would commend the region to resume engaging these professional services. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We won't mention names, Richard, but thank you very much. Jessica.
Yes, right. My mic is on for once.
There you go.
I wanted to say a little bit about the questions of inequality and youth. My feeling is that one of the repercussions of COVID-19 is going to be in various parts of the region, new crises with young people. Young people have really been shortchanged over the past year. They've been very much shortchanged in their access to education and in their chances of gainful employment once they're finished with school or university. And I believe that Caribbean governments and private sectors, hopefully in dialogue with foreign partners in the United States and elsewhere, will need to think very seriously about more microcredit being provided, more support for youth entrepreneurs, particularly in areas like the cultural industries, more access to marketing, training, and so on. I think this is going to be very important to give young people a chance. Now, on the broader social protection front, one thing that has become very clear is how weak we are in health insurance across the region. This is a problem. It's more acute in certain countries than others, and access to affordable healthcare when it's needed. And I think we are going to, notwithstanding all the fiscal constraints that we have at present, give attention to health and social protection for the really marginalized parts of our population. These are going to be, they have to be on the agenda moving forward.
Very good. Thank you, Jessica. Dan?
Sure, just a couple additional points. I mean, one, just to underscore once again how important climate is going to be, I think, in moving forward. And, you know, I think that the Caribbean can really fit into this discussion in very interesting ways and should follow it closely. And you know, it's not all about rising sea levels. I mean, it's also about new technologies, creating jobs, adding value. I mean, it has a whole series, I think, of secondary effects that really do deal with some of the core issues, including, you know, as has been discussed in the United States, climate justice is racial justice as well. And so I think that, you know, I just underscore the importance of this. Secondly, I'm really glad that the diaspora came up several times in this conversation. It's so important. And I actually would commend David. I don't know what your paper schedule looks like after George's paper, but it seems that if there's not a Caribbean diaspora paper on the horizon, you know, there probably should be. I think that that's just such a, you know, such a critical issue. And then lastly, looking at the multilateral questions, you know, and a comment was raised in the chat about this, and I think there does have to be some taking of stock about how the Caribbean and the United States have interacted in multilateral institutions over the last several years. And is there a way forward on this that would be more constructive for all the parties involved?
Good, thank you. Andrea?
Thank you. Like Jessica, I also wanted to focus on the question around youth and the need to create opportunities for them. I mean, in a large part, this is actually why I focus on issues around trade and economic growth, because the economies of the region need to expand so that they can provide more opportunities. At the same time, underscoring the point about governments creating that business operating environment, but also providing access, greater access to finance. I mean, the people are our best renewable resource, right? So everything else will disappear, but or can disappear. I also want to, very quickly point to Bruce Zagaris pointed out about the need for, or the fact that governments are not the only actors or entities that can get engaged and negotiate agreements. There can be university and have been university to university exchanges led by Ambassador Bernal, civil society, NGOs, etc. So that is really important. And finally, to Dan's last point about there being opportunity, I guess this is Chinese proverb, there's opportunity even in the face of challenges and risks. So climate change also, precisely because it's such an existential threat to the region, is something that we should lead on, not just in terms of our advocacy, but also in terms of coming together to find solutions that can be implemented in the marketplace. Thank you.
Very good, thank you. We have 2 full minutes, and I have 2 last questions, and Ambassador Bernal, one is actually to you, so I'll bring it to your attention. One commenting that the human talent capital resource base in the region is yet an unleveraged strategic instrument of our foreign policy. This comes from a Caribbean diplomat in Washington. And then a very specific question to Ambassador Bernal regarding Jamaica's growth in exports during the past few years, and how maybe other countries in the region can look to expand their exports, including to Asia and other markets along similar lines. And your name was mentioned, so that's why I thought we'd do it. And we have exactly 1 minute before FIU IT closes us. Go ahead.
Thank you, moderator. 3 quick questions, responses to those questions. One is that there's a disjuncture between the education system and the skills which will be required for future jobs. Secondly, we need new exports, and they can be in the area of services which depend on skills. 2, offshore healthcare, export of higher education services. And I would say that these are the key areas which will provide some possibilities for the region, but we have to solve the disjuncture of education and skills.
Wonderful. Thank you very much all to the audience for sticking with us this full 1.5 hours. And you will all be receiving more information from FIU and from the CPC regarding this seminar, this webinar, the paper by George Forial, and our next engagements in March and in May. Thank you all very much. Have a good day.